This material is made available to you by or on behalf of the University of Melbourne under Section 113P of the Copyright Act 1968. It may be subject to copyright. For more information, visit the University Copyright website.
Okay, there it goes. All right. We are precisely an hour behind in our calendar for the semester, but that's okay for a number of reasons. The first is that I kind of planned this last session to have some extra time in it. So if we end up an hour behind, we can make up some time. The other reason is because the second hour that we were going to talk about this week, quantitative data analysis and presentation, is not a core part of your assignment. You don't have to actually do any quantitative data analysis or presentation. So if we miss that content, you won't be wondering what to do in your methodology statement. So for two reasons, I think we're still fine. And I like that the class has been interactive and that you've decided to kind of allow it to take a little more time. So today, Friday, you'll be submitting your assignment to Saturday. Saturday's fine. Sorry. Okay. I think if you haven't figured out by now how I feel about deadlines, my basic stance is the university allows me a certain amount of extension that I'm allowed to grant without special permission from the university. As long as you ask in advance of the deadline, I don't need a reason. I just need an email saying I'd like to turn it in on this other day instead. So I don't have a strong stance on extensions, and I think I told you at the beginning I once had an 18-month extension on an assignment when I was an undergraduate. Did I not tell you this story? Yeah, 18 months. Every month I called the professor because it was back before email was really a thing. And I was like, oh, I just can't get to it. And he was like, just take another month. So 18 times I did that. And finally I turned it in and I ended up with an A, like a 97% for the class. But, he was just really beautiful about it because it was a paper on Hegel. It was tough. It was not that it was an impossible thing. It was just that I just didn't do it. I just didn't get to it. And there were things going on, and everybody's got their things going on. But yeah, so thank you, Dr. Thoreau, to you. Now that you can thank him. Way back in Pennsylvania in the late 90s, that's the reason you get extensions up to the amount I'm allowed to grant without any explanation. I don't need your medical excuse. You can tell me your excuse if you want to, but you don't have to. I have a blanket policy, and that's how I work. But that's not how most people work. So in academics, we do have deadlines, but most things can be renegotiated. And in life, that's kind of how things are. There are lots of things that can't be renegotiated, and you've got to decide how you're going to handle those, or how to make sure you don't violate one of those things that can't be renegotiated. But many things can be renegotiated. You just have to be willing to do the work to renegotiate it. So as long as you're willing to do the work, fine with me. And fortunately for me, it doesn't take very much work. So any questions? The university's policy is 10 days, by the way, working days. So after that, I have to ask for permission. And what that means is you have to ask for permission. So there's a special consideration process then that kicks in after that. But I'm allowed to grant up to 10 working days. So everybody's got a different life, different things going on. So here we are, Saturday, or whenever, is coming your 2A. I believe that I probably made a mistake when I assigned that for Saturday. I might have been shooting for Friday and got my year wrong or something. I don't know exactly how it ended up on a Saturday. We'll just keep it there. And again, renegotiation is always possible. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about, in the tutorial today, you're going to discuss what you have to do with that methodology statement once it comes in. But we got a little bit of housekeeping, and I'll spend a little time explaining it to you, and then you'll have more chance to ask questions here or in the tutorial. So there's been a bit of confusion about the word limits. Hopefully, you've also found with your marking in your first assignment that we're much more interested in the content that you generate than things like word limits. But the problem statement was meant to be about 1,500 words. It makes sense to have that problem statement frame your methodology statement. It's meant to be the front end of that. So if you would like to have your problem statement kind of stapled to the front of your methodology statement, that's okay with us. You can do that. That way you don't have to rewrite the beginning to make it coherent. So your draft methodology statement and your final methodology statement are basically the same assignment. So you're reviewing a somewhat midway version of your methodology statement. So this 1,200 words is, hey, get it to 1,200 words by this date so that your peer has something to review. The final submission should be, the final methodology statement part of the submission is going to be 2,000 words. So that could include that 1,200. Your peer review might come back and might be like, oh man, this is awful. You've got to rewrite the whole thing. It doesn't usually happen that way, but that's the worst case scenario. None of those 1,200 are useful. Very rare, very unlikely to happen to anybody. This final thing is 2,000 words. So we're not going to see this unless there's a problem. The academic staff are not going to see the draft methodology statement. And you're not submitting it through Turnitin per se. You are submitting it to Turnitin, but we're not putting it through Turnitin as a plagiarism catch. So it won't get picked up in the final methodology statement. We did put the problem statement through. So if the final has your problem statement as part of it, that front end will get caught by the plagiarism tracker, but we just will disregard it. So it's fine. It's just a thing that we have to kind of work with the technology that's available. So you'll be submitting your draft as normal, but we won't be marking it. You're going to be doing the peer review exercise on it. And then, so the end thing could be up to, 3,500 words. N plus 1,000. 500. You may have noticed I'm not that detail-oriented by now. Ish, if it's longer, if it's shorter, I would rather see you do the assignment well. I have a student who's just, the standard doctoral thesis is allowed to be up to 100,000 words. One's just submitted a thesis at 60,000. 60% of the allowed length. It's brilliant. It's parsimonious. It's awesome. It's done. It doesn't need any more. Sometimes you don't need all the words. In research design, you often do need all the words. So just be aware of that. Significant overlap is okay between those drafts. But your final thing, just be aware that you're allowed, you're kind of going to be around that mark. If you decide to include this 1,500 in the final statement, which it makes sense to do because your research questions need to be in there and everything. Any questions on, yes?
I have a question. So I just copy and pasted my first assignment across and then started writing this assignment.
That's what I would have done.
The only thing is that for my methodology section, like I've got precedents and things, like I use Brown and stuff, like how I came up with my methodology, but I don't have any references to go into kind of, I guess, like the exact detail. Like I've said, there was a study like this that did this and referenced it like that. Then when I'm writing what I'm doing, I don't have any references. Is that okay? Because it's like we're making it up.
Yeah. So the question was less about stapling it and more about like how much should I be referencing as I'm making up my own method. When you do your, so you can reference a few ways. So it's called a methodology statement rather than a method, because in a method you basically just say what you're doing. In a methodology, you're deciding what to do out of the possible options. So why did you decide to use an interview technique instead of a focus group technique? And for that, the best statements will have decided based on some review of studies that do focus groups and some that do interviews, and thinking about which of those is more applicable to your problem or the particular way you're explaining your problem. So those are the ways that you can cite things inside your methodological review. Like, all these studies did it with focus groups. Nobody's ever done it with interviews. That's why I'm doing it this way. Or focus groups don't give us enough opportunity for private reflection. And that's why I'm doing interviews. So inside of a method, you can cite. Another way to do it would be to think about what someone like Breiman says. Breiman may say, a qualitative hypothesis is optional. Breiman does say that. I've looked this up in Breiman because I have a lot of debates with Richard Tomlinson over whether there's such a thing as a qualitative hypothesis. Breiman agrees with me. Thank you, Breiman. Maybe that's why I keep buying his book. And so if you want to have a qualitative hypothesis, you might say, this is consistent with Breiman's discussion on qualitative hypotheses on page something. Can't remember where it is. Definitely in there. And that's another way to cite a decision you've made. So a method is what you do as a method will be a set of decisions out of the methodology, which is the kind of review and study of the available methods that you've got. So the best ones will convince the reader that you've picked the right way. And more to the point, convince yourself that you've picked the right way. The point of this is not to necessarily present the best methodology statement ever. It's to show us that you've considered a few things. If you're in if you're looking at travel behavior, you've considered the self-selection problem. If you're trying to understand, a question that could be approached qualitatively or quantitatively, you've considered what both approaches can give you, and you've made a decision. So it's about commitment. Some people are commitment phobic. It's about taking a stand for what you're going to do. Just for a little while. It's just a semester commitment. They're not, not asking you to move in just for a semester, and then, then you can move out again. You take your fridge with you if you want. Does that answer your question? Any other questions? You can't take your cat, though. Get the cat. All right, so here's where we are in the semester. And we'll be so next week we're going to be asking again for reviewing the work of peers. So this week we're going over the assignment and also just talking about critical review of peer work. Next week we're going to be asking for volunteers again. So your tutor will be organizing that today, and 2 volunteers per tutorial. And there were a few tutorials last week in week 7 that got canceled because nobody volunteered. That will happen again if nobody volunteers. So if you don't want to use that opportunity to improve your work and nobody else does, then we don't see any reason to run a tutorial. So please do volunteer today. It's a good chance to have someone look in advance at your work. It's a courageous thing to do. Zheng and I were just talking about living with courage. And you know, especially like I've told you, right, that the vast majority of people are less afraid of dying than they are of public speaking. It's you know, I find myself running a thing that requires me to be at the center of a large organization, and be leading a group of people that I don't feel competent to lead, because they're all these amazing experts in all these areas. And yet here I am. Either I'm the best you get, because in this organization it's either me or nobody. So it's the point of this is that stepping up to do something doesn't always have to be comfortable, but sometimes you can view it as an act of courage. And I'm certainly trying to think that way about my organization at the moment. So if you can think of it as an act of courage and do it even though it's uncomfortable, it's a chance to get some feedback before you turn it in. And it's good for you, but it's also good for others to see how a peer review goes live so that they can learn from that process. So you're also helping other people, in case that motivates you. All right, so I do want to talk a bit about what this, I'll go back to this, I'll go back to the other slides, but let's see if I can figure this out. Yes, so the other question, oh, is it 15 minutes? Thanks. All right. All right, so assignment 2. That says Friday, it means Saturday. Sorry. I believe I did adjust the date. Ah!
We'll take it.
It's been.
I'll take that date.
When is the date? Is it the 12th? You want the 10th? I did correct this. That's so weird. I swear I corrected it. I do not understand. Maybe. Okay. You know what we're going for here. 12th of May, which is Saturday. I must have corrected it and then put the wrong set of slides back up. Okay. But the substantive part of this is that your peer review is submitted this weekend or by negotiation. And we're not going to see it. So us teaching staff are not going to be looking at this draft unless there's a problem. I'll talk about what those problems might look like. So you should be in touch with your team, your group, and you should be exchanging all those papers via email so that they get them directly. But we still need a submission from you on the LMS. So that's just going to be in case there's a problem. So in case if one of your peer reviewers come back and said, I never got the draft, we can look at the LMS and say, well, we got it. And then we can start having a conversation about what happened to the email draft. Or if your teammate, what if you disappear for the weekend because you're like hiking somewhere and your teammate needs the draft and you've emailed it but it's sitting in your outbox? Well, we can pass it along because we'll have it in the LMS system. So submit it via Turnitin. Submit everything you need to by Turnitin, but also be communicating with your teammates. When you submit the feedback, you're going to be thinking about things that I've given you, that way in the back of the subject guide, there are a set of instructions about how this peer review is going to work. But you should critically analyze the research questions. Is it clearly stated? Is it appropriately specific? Does it contain vague or hypothetical language? Does it have can in it? Is it operationalizable? Is it aligned with the problem identified? That's the number one problem we find across master's theses and across research designed by students is that there's not an alignment between the research question and then what you propose to do. And sometimes that's a process of coming back to the original research question and going, okay, now I've thought about what I'm going to do. Does my research question still match? And sometimes it's a matter of retrofitting the research question. You might like your method. In fact, you might discover what you want to do by articulating your method. So when I'm advising master's theses, something I often find is that I'm like, okay, we've been spun over and over and over again about research questions. Go start outlining what you're going to do. When people start outlining what they're going to do, they find, oh boy, like I really do want to do interviews because I want to talk to people. Or I really, when I start thinking about the questions I'm going to ask, I get more clear about what I want to know. So for your peer review, you're going to be talking about, is the research question good enough? Is the method of research well articulated, justified, and appropriate for the research question? You're going to analyze how realistic the proposed activities are, given the budget, timeline, et cetera. Professional ethics considerations made, if there are any. The extent to which assertions are supported by evidence and examples, and any other kinds of details. And if you add any citations, like if you say, why don't you look at Breiman, just give them a citation so they know where to look. So if you're pointing, you're not required to point them to any resources, but if you do, just make sure you give them something. It doesn't have to be a formal citation, just to, make sure that they know where to go and look for things. So 12th of May. You are going to be submitting 7 things out of this peer review exercise. So there are 4 pieces of assessment and 3 pieces of work that you are submitting. So you're submitting first your actual draft methodology statement, your 1,200 words, plus 1,500 if you go away. Then you're submitting now this is a normal team. If you're not on one of those 2-person teams or 4-person teams, although the 4-person team could still do it this way. You're also submitting your wait a second. Your 2 peer reviews, yes. So you're submitting your statement, and then you're doing 2 peer reviews, 1 for 2 peers. So you're submitting 3 things that we're never going to see unless there's a problem. And then 4 pieces on top of that. So 7 in total. And those 4 pieces are these 2 peer review assessments and the 2 self-assessments of a peer review. So 4 things that we are going to assess. And basically, because you're in a group and you're swapping these things around, you're gonna peer review me, I'm gonna peer review you, and then I'm gonna rate myself as a peer reviewer, and I'm gonna rate you as a peer reviewer. So every student will have 4 pieces of information. This is very confusing, by the way. You should try marking it. It's really, it's a big spaghetti mess. Zhang was kind enough to try to make a visual of it, and he may, if you're in his tutorial, he may show you, but it's a spaghetti. It's got nice straight lines, still spaghetti. But the point is that my review of myself reviewing you and your review of me are going to form one part of your mark. So those 4 pieces are going to kind of be averaged together, but they're in pairs. So I'm going to review myself for your peer review, and you're going to review me for my peer review. So over that 1 peer review, I'm getting 2 pieces of assessment. My self-assessment, how did I do? Got a 7 out of 10. How does she think I did on it? She told me I got an 8 out of 10. Fantastic. My mark is a 7.5. Now, if those 2, if the self-assessment and the review by your peer are very close, within 20%, then we're not going to have any problem with that. It's just going to be the average of the 2. If those 2 pieces are really far apart, let's say I rate myself as a 10 out of 10 and you rate me as a 3, that's when we're going to start looking at the actual assignment submitted and the actual peer review submitted. So we don't know, so if you give me a 3 and I give myself a 10, there could be a number of reasons. I could have done a really crappy peer review, and I was trying to see if I could get myself a 10. You could have given me not a lot to review. Maybe I got, you only submitted 200 words and they weren't very good and I had not a lot to go on. Maybe there's a genuine misunderstanding. So because you're in groups, you can work a lot of these problems out. And so we're counting on you to kind of take the bulk of that work. But if there's a genuine disagreement about what was required, then that's why we've asked you to submit all the three things on LMS so that we can go back to it and go, well, this was a 200-word draft. Not a lot of people could do much with that as a peer review. So she's done what she can, but the peer review says, well, you've got to comment on the research methods, and this person didn't have any. So that's kind of why we're doing it that way. So at the back of your syllabus, there are two forms. One is the peer review assessment, this one. And so this is the student, this has you as a student who's submitting it and the student who provided the peer review and the date. So that's one thing. And then the second form is the self-assessment of the peer review. So this is your form to rate yourself. How did I do? And through this, we want you to, really reflect on how well did you perform this peer review? What did you, how specific were you? Did you hit the right content? So we're going to talk more about these in the tutorial today. And there are certain criteria out of 100 that are very closely aligned to the criteria for examining the final thing that we will actually look at. That's all very confusing, but you have to get it right. So you have to submit the 4 things plus the 3 things, the 7 things. 3 of them we'll never look at unless there's a problem. Last year there were hardly any problems. So I think most groups are able to handle this, but you never know. If your group does get into a problem, you can let me know. Okay, so sometimes there may be special things. So if your group, for instance, only has 2 members, then obviously you only need to submit 1 of each. The good thing is you only have to do 1. The bad thing is that you will be entirely assessed on that 1. So unless you have merged your group into another group of 2, in that case you can only do still the 4 pieces. You can just decide how you're going to allocate in the group. You can also do peer reviews on all of them if you want to, and if you want to submit them, it's fine. If you think that third one's going to raise your average a bit, that's certainly possible to do that. Okay, what if all of my teammates have dropped the subject and I'm the only one left, or I'm in a group of 2 and my team member is missing. I can't find them. Just let me know as soon as you can. So everybody should have made contact with your group by now, but if I get an email in the next few days, I can still reassign you to one of those groups of 2. So just let me know as soon as you can if you can't find your teammates, but you really should be on top of this. Okay, other notes. It's complicated. You still got to do it. So even if you don't understand, you've got to find a way to understand. And if you don't submit the assignment, this is a peer review. So this is where I really care about deadlines. This is a peer review. This is not Jenny having to spend an extra week in June finding your work and marking it. This is your responsibility to coordinate with your peer. I do not want to hear my teammate let me down. So if you don't submit the pieces of the assignment, you just will not get credit for them. I care much. Now, if something doesn't make it up onto LMS, but you can show me that you've given these peer reviews to your peer, that's the part I care about the most. How it comes to us, I'm much more flexible about. But you've got to honor your commitments to each other. So if you do nothing else, honor your commitments to each other. That will make me very happy. If you So the deadlines I've given you for these, for the submission of peer reviews, again, are in here. If you are going to renegotiate that, 2B, so those are meant to be due on the 12th of May, which is also a Saturday. Again, if you're going to need to renegotiate that, the first person you need to renegotiate with is your team, the first people, the people who it's going to be late for. Because again, we're not going to see any of this unless, well, it's going to be coming into LMS. Those assignment 2B will get submitted via LMS. But the first thing I'll ask you if you say, can we submit assignment 2B 5 days late, is have you negotiated with your team? Is everybody okay with that? Because week 10, I mean, some people may have a bunch of assignments and they really want to get it done in week 11 so that they don't have it looming over their heads for the end of May. So you've got to really be sure that you're meeting the expectations of the people that matter the most. If your teammate submits the methodology statement and you don't have time to do a proper peer review, now this, again, you've negotiated, you've done what you can, it's still late and you don't have time, please do let me know. So this will be next Friday. So if you don't get your methodology statement and you want it and you haven't agreed to a renegotiated timeline, I just need to hear about it as fast as you can get me the news so that I can do something about it. I want you to have everything you need in the time that you need and be able to plan your time. But I can't do that if you don't help me out. Thank you. If by the end of next week I haven't heard anything, I will presume everything's fine. Hi. So by Friday next week or the Monday after, if we haven't heard, we'll just assume everything's working. Okay. So any questions about the assignment? It's all very confusing. Like I said, it's worse actually marking it than it is doing it. So once you get your head into it, it's really just discrete tasks, and hopefully it'll make sense. If you find yourself struggling, just reach out.
So with those final 4 components, is that rankings? They're not more words, correct?
Yeah. It is good to give some, well, okay, so let's see, here we are. Where's my slide? There are some sampling. There are spaces for comments. So expect about 600 words on this thing. To do a good peer review, you've got to give the person some justification. So it's not just, 6 out of 25 with no explanation. So this should be, something like, I think we've allocated 12. Let's see, how many words have we allocated? Going back. Peer review of draft methodology statement, 1,200 words, so that's 600 each peer review.
So is that the review or
This is the assessment. So these things, again, it's all, you're doing your peer review, and then you're doing this, and we've allocated 1,200 words for that entire summation. So this can be, a lot of it can be repurposed from your peer review too.
how many words? Should that also be 600 words?
Yeah-ish, enough words, 400, 600, enough. If it's a really awful paper, you might need to write more. If you've given it a 25 out of 25, you don't really need to say much. You might So let's see. The only way to, I mean, really think about this is to get into it. But critically analyze the research question. Is the research question clearly stated? You might just say research question clearly stated. Or you might say research question contains can. Jenny said can is almost never appropriate in research question. Reconsider the research question. Or you might say the research question doesn't align with the methods. But you kind of, if you've given it a tough rating, you might want to explain why. This is the peer review. And then the peer review, so this is the peer review assessment. The review addresses the required questions. So you might not hit every one of these points. You could just kind of, copy these and say yes, 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 no, yes, no. But you can also kind of give a more detailed explanation of why not. So, tone of the review is respectful, right? If you didn't feel like that was a thing that was adhered to in the review, you can kind of say that. It was accusatory or it wasn't quite the right language. I would have liked to see something less critical or less mean. So yeah, this thing is not. I mean, you can get away with 200 to 600 words. Again, the whole thing, peer review plus the two things, are meant to be hit in about 1,200 words. So, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. I did. So these are meant to be 300 words each. So it's about 600 for the peer review and about 300 each for the two forms. Sorry. Have I got you? Have I?
Then the self-assessment as well. So is it 300? So 100 is for the peers, and then I'm sorry.
300, 300, 300.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you do 300?
So yeah, the total is 1,200. Let's see if I can get this straight. And there are 4 forms. So there's PRA1 and PRA2, and self-assessment 1 and self-assessment 2. So if the whole thing is 1,200 words, then but you've also got, so these are the things you're turning in, plus your peer review. So rather than trying to think about this and getting it wrong, let's just look. So methodology statement there in draft. Peer review methodology statement is meant to be 1,200 words in total. How have I allocated this in the assessment guide? So there's the method. All right, so problem statement, we're past this. Methodology statement, part A. Okay. Oh, here we are, 1,200 words. 600 per peer review. So, you're right. Maybe I haven't given you a word count for the actual peer review. Which is maybe a little bit not fair. But let's see. $2,000, $35, $45, $47. Still well below my 5,500 word limit. So I think we're all right. Maybe it's just an arithmetic error. why don't you just plan on 600, oops, and 300 for each of these. And thank you for pointing out my lack of specificity. So 600 for the peer review-ish, basically just till it's done.
Sorry.
Yep, so it's 300 each.
300.
So 300 each, not per each.
Well, you know, it's 3, 6, 9, 12, and there are 700 words left. Yep, that's a pretty short peer review.
But then if you was right, say, like if you wanted to like, go into your own time and say, right, 700 words peer review, that means that you're going to give a better mark for self-reflection. You're the person reviewing you is probably going to give you a better mark. So if there's not an actual word limit, it'd be in your best interest, wouldn't it, to write as much.
I guess it would. I misadded. We don't want to do that, do we? Okay, worth getting this sorted out. Okay, 1,500. Oh, wait. 2,500. We have. So this 2,000 and this 1,200 have a lot of overlap. All right. So it's really, right now, without the peer review, we have a 3,500. So we have about 2,000 words for this peer review. For the whole thing. Despite the fact, well, I guess there is an indirect assessment. You're pointing out a very good point, which is that you're not assessed on this peer review. So that's probably why I didn't think to include it in the total. But you are assessed on the products of the peer review. But this peer review really is. So let's see. We have 3,500 words in total plus the 1,200 for the peer review, which puts us at 4,700 words. So that leaves us with 800 words for the to do the peer review, which is about the front of a page, single-spaced, 500 words. So that makes a lot of sense. So this is about the amount that people have done in the past and gotten H1s for it, largely because that 800, or because of that review process, people have felt pretty satisfied. All right, so thank you very much. This is a good reason why we ask questions. 800 words each, or 400 words each. So you should be able to achieve a proper peer review in 400 words, and that is about right. So this must have been what I was thinking when I designed this, even though I didn't spell it out very well in the subject guide. My apologies. I think we've sorted it out now. I will send an email summarizing this. So I think that sorts it out. There's a little bit of confusion, but these are each 300 words. The two actual peer reviews are 400 words, and that gets us up to 5,500 for the subject, which is the maximum word limit. But if you're going to achieve a good peer review and you plan to do it in 400 words, don't get to the end of the 400 words and then be like, oh, I've run out of room, so I'm not doing the methods now or something. I mean, you just want to be more parsimonious in what you actually say.
So what happened when I just have one member? Or the other two groups? It's a two members group.
Yep, so your two members group, and you've decided not to merge with another two-member group, then you've got some decisions to make. So you can spend some more time doing more peer reviews. You can spend some more time on your peer review. So you can do, again, we're not going to see this unless there's a problem. So you can.
I was talking about the word limit because you said that for peer review we have to write for around 400 words.
Yep.
So I just have one paper to
Yep.
So I have to write 800 words for one field?
No, you can still do it in 400. But you can spend more time on it because now you've got more time. So you can give the mother of all reviews. Have I answered the questions? Okay, excellent. Thank you for that. And I think it's a worthwhile point that it's good to have, if you're trying to contain the assignment from not getting too out of hand, then it makes sense to try to be really clear about what words get allocated where. I think you will find that when you're working with peers, it's much less about words and much more about the contribution you make to their work, which is probably why I spent less time than I should have articulating the word limits. Any other questions? Time. Okay. We're going here. I'll flick this up. All right. So some of this content was prepared by PhD student Xin Yang, whose thesis I was just talking about a little while ago. Who did it in 60% of the word count. So I'm just acknowledging her work. So when we're talking about quasi-experimental design, this is about quantitative research questions where we have the capacity to sometimes infer causality. So when we're looking to do things like evaluate policies, if you're like, hey, there's this new policy and I want to know if it worked. There are some times when we can develop quasi-experiments, and those quasi-experiments will allow us to achieve a certain amount of certainty that it was actually the policy that produced the effect, rather than, say, something else, like a change in the national economy or migration policy or something. So we're going to talk about when we think about quasi-experiments, setting them up, the kind of notation that we use with them, and kind of some of the key principles. For research for questions that are framed around causality, if we want to know whether the policy produced or caused a certain effect, we might ask in a way, like, did the policy X cause changes in Y? Or did the intervention of policy X improve something Y? Did the implementation of policy X mitigate Y? So it might have actually been that the thing didn't improve. Jobs housing balance didn't improve. But it would have been even worse if we hadn't had the policy. So it's not necessarily only true that it's about did the policy improve the situation. The policy might have just kept the situation from getting even worse. And that's still a policy success in some, depending on how you formulate the policy. So we're in this space of like, what is a quasi-experiment? A quasi-experiment is not an experiment. So if we're in a chemistry laboratory, we can set up an experiment where we control the experimental conditions. If we're in a medical trial, we can control the experimental conditions. So we can say, you get the medicine, you do not. We're going to see what happens to the groups. And just randomly decide who gets it and who doesn't, and then and see how much better the treatment group was than the control group at the end of a certain analysis period. But we can do random assignment in clinical trials. We can't do random assignment in social sciences, not usually. And that's because people have this tendency to go and do things based on their preferences rather than based on what the researchers want them to do. It's a very annoying thing that people do, acting on their own preferences instead of doing what we want them to do. But that's what they do. So a quasi-experiment then is an experiment in which units are not assigned randomly. Oops. And an experiment is which an intervention is deliberately introduced. So we want to know what's the effect of a drug. We deliberately introduce the drug. We look at the condition of the group before and the condition of the group after, and that's an experiment. That is the thing we can't do in the social sciences. So the idea, the notion of a quasi-experiment is the conversion and the adaptation of this scientific experimental construct to non-laboratory settings, to what we do. So you have to buy into this idea that the world in the social sciences is there to be discovered, that there is something underlying that can be observed, just like we can in a scientific kind of framework, scientific way of thinking. Now, you may not buy into that. If that's the case, it's a very good idea to articulate why. There's lots of very good research that does not take a quasi-experimental approach. But most quantitative research does. Almost all of it, in fact. So if you're doing quantitative work, if you're doing confirmatory work, in a sense, you have bought into the epistemological idea that the scientific principles that exist to observe things like medical interventions can also be applied to the social sciences and understanding the human condition. So when you're articulating qualitative methods, sometimes some of the justification is, I don't buy into this idea that observing the human condition can mimic the scientific process. There are great scholars like Michael Burawoy, who's just fantastic, and I love his paper on reflexive science. So if you're in the qualitative space, Michael Burawoy, W-O-Y, he's a sociologist. And he takes issue with this idea that the scientific process is the only way to discover things about the human condition. So there are other methods that are available, like his reflexive science. But today we're in the accepting of this paradigm of the world space, and so that's what we're going to talk about. So I really like this book by Shadish, Cook, and Campbell. And I refer a lot of people to that book if they're going to do. I took a whole class on quasi-experimental design, 45 hours of instruction on quasi-experimental designs. And one thing I found out was that in that class is if you have a data set that's already been collected, there might be a quasi-experimental design that can allow you to find something out about that data, no matter how bizarre the data set is. So we're going to be talking in here, this is just a crash bang quick overview of the gold standards, the thing that the most common quasi-experimental designs and some of the best ones, but also the threats to validity that the ones we often choose in the social sciences, the threats to validity that they introduce. So the whole point of an experiment is to observe what happens when we introduce that change, that shock, that treatment. And from an experiment, we can infer a causal relationship. We can say, this person got better because of the drug or a placebo effect. What we know also from medical trials is that anywhere between 15 and 30% of the effect of a drug appears to be placebo. It wasn't actually the drug, it was because the person thought they were getting better. But it does allow us to infer this idea of causality. So, and we use that a lot in diet and drugs and other natural science research. And what experimental conditions do for inferring a causal relationship is they cause if you have a causal relationship, in order to get a causal relationship, you have to observe first that the cause preceded the effect. So first we introduced the drug, and then the patient got better. So you can't have the patient get better and then introduce the drug. It doesn't make any sense. Well, it does, but not for the drug. The cause and the effect have to be related. So if you introduce a drug, but we don't think the drug actually did anything, there could be other reasons why that effect was produced that maybe didn't have to do with the drug. So that the conditions of an experiment is that they actually have to be related to each other. And the third one, which is the most important, is that there's no other plausible explanation. Nothing else changed. We hold that most other conditions to be reasonably static. So if the person, when they were taking the drug, also went and started a completely new diet, right? It could be the diet. If they moved from one city to a country town, it could be the move, or the country town, or the new house doesn't have asbestos in it, or something. So in an experimental condition, what you're trying to do is hold as many things constant as possible to see whether it's actually the treatment that's causing the effect. So if you want causality, you need all of those things to be in place. Now, some of these things we have in the social sciences. We often have the cause preceded the effect. So we have our policy happen first. This is where it gets hairy. The cause and the effect were related. We're not always sure. Could have been something else, because in non-experimental conditions, lots of other things happen all at the same time. There was a new migration policy, some time went by, there was a new urban plan, there were a whole bunch of new things that changed. And because we don't have experimental conditions, because we have the messy part of humans actually walking around in the world, there could be lots of other explanations for the thing happening. So Karl Popper talked about the logic of falsification, logic of the falsificationist. Basically, this is where we spend a lot of our time, trying to come up with the other possible alternatives that could explain the effect we saw, and to see whether we can also rule those out. If we want causality, this is what we have to do. It's a very heavy burden. So causal inferences come through what we call a counterfactual logic. So we can't just observe what happened. We actually have to observe what would have happened if the thing that happened didn't happen. Yes, that's confusing, right? It's not only about what did happen, it's about what would have happened if this hadn't happened. So in some ways, it's impossible. We can't observe the counterfactual, the thing that didn't actually happen, except that we sometimes can try. So in a medical trial, in an experimental condition, the way they observe that is they have a randomly selected treatment group and a randomly selected control group. And the treatment group is the group that gets the thing, the drug, the dietary intervention, whatever it is. The control group is the counterfactual. It's the measurement of what would have happened if there had been no intervention. And the way that we judge the success of an experiment is, did getting the intervention change anything? So in experimental conditions, we know this because the control group had one outcome and the treatment group had a different outcome. So we know something's happened. But again, in the social sciences, it's trickier. But this effect is essentially the difference between what would have happened with the treatment group and what would happen with the control group. And the reason we know about that placebo effect is because of this setup. Because when we look at drug effectiveness, what you see is even the patients themselves don't know if they've gotten the drug or not. Not even the doctors administering the drug know they're giving a placebo. So about 30% of the time, the patients get better, even if they got, when they got no drug. So that's how we can observe this placebo effect. It's very interesting. But it's about that difference between what would have happened and what would have happened and what did happen. So this is the space where we're working in the social sciences. Can we ever observe the counterfactual? Will we ever be able to observe Melbourne without Plan Melbourne? No. There's no part of Plan Melbourne that didn't get Plan Melbourne. Every place got it. I'm going to show you some ways that we try to work around this to create treatment and control groups. But sometimes causal inferences is not possible. And so we're stuck trying to understand our policy without being able to understand causality. And this is the human condition. This is the problem with living in only one reality, which we think we do. Although there's a whole bunch of quantum physics that suggests that in 20 years we may be talking about this differently. So in quasi-experimental design, in the social sciences, our solution is to try to create approximations to that counterfactual. Try to come up with a way to think about what would have happened and whether we can observe it or not. So we come up with what I've called the treatment group, which we can also call the compare group. So these are people or census areas or businesses or some group that received a treatment of some sort. They got an intervention. They got a shock. Now that treatment might be a policy. It might also just be a random thing that occurred in, say, the economy. It doesn't have to be a deliberate action, but it's a group that received something. And then what we're trying to come up with is a group that didn't. That was in roughly the same place at the same time, but didn't receive the treatment for some reason. So I had a student once who did a really cool master's thesis where he was looking at the effect of historic preservation. And what he noticed was that there were some places where one side of the street, the houses were protected by historic overlays. And right across the street, they weren't. So he picked, for his treatment and control groups, houses that were located right across the street from each other, where on one side of the street they were protected by historical overlay and the other side weren't. He didn't pick these out here or these out here or these out here, but these are so close to each other. The only thing that was different was that they were on one side of the street or the other. And then he was looking at the effect of housing prices on those two groups of houses and did find the historic overlay increased housing prices. So our task is to be clever about this and try to come up with that control group and the comparison group to try to see whether there's a difference between the control group and the treatment group over the same period. When we're trying to do this, we're looking for randomness in a couple of key respects. So in an experiment, we're looking for we can control randomness. So we can randomly assign drug, no drug out of a group that we have. And so we're looking to randomly assign whether you're in a treatment or a control group. Again, we're still in the experimental condition now. In a quasi-experiment, you don't get that kind of flexibility. You don't get that kind of freedom, typically. Is it time to take a break? I think it is. Sorry. So we're just one slide from quasi-experiments. So I'll just talk about this, and then we'll take a 5-minute break. So there are some limitations when you're trying to make causal generalizations in an experimental setting. So one of them that Shadish and Cook and Campbell point out is that we, as experimenters, are subject to some of the bias that occurs. We want our experiment to succeed. We want our drug to succeed. We want our dietary intervention to succeed. So we are presuming that the experiment is a clear window, but they don't. But their unstated assumptions could bias the experimental conditions, which is why we do things to try to control for even the knowledge of the person administering the drug, whether they're actually giving a drug or not. Because what we know is that there are all kinds of biases and assumptions about the way, so if you're smiling when you administer the drug or frowning, that can actually change the effect of the drug. So there's a whole bunch of context and unstated assumptions that can affect the outcome of an experimental result. This is not a class about experiments, so we're not going to go too much into this. Your sampling strategy can affect this, as can the variation in the way that you treat participants, the setting where you give the drug or don't. If the intervention is something very invasive that requires surgery, then you can't really control an experiment. You can't give a random surgery to a person who you're not going to deliver a treatment to. That would be really ethically problematic. So some of those things, we still don't have perfect conditions, even in experimental conditions, all the time. And of course, the statistical processes that we use have biases in them as well. Now, this is well beyond the scope of our subject. We do get into the soul of statistics if you take urban demography and statistics, and that'll be next year. But we're not going to really go into it too much here. I want to focus the bulk of this talk on, instead, quasi-experiments, which are our approximations of experimental design in the social sciences, where people don't behave and go and do what they want, and then we have to try to understand things about them and whether interventions, treatments, policies produce some different result than what we would have had otherwise. So let's take our 5-minute break. Sorry, we ran over a little. It's 12:12. Let's come back at 12:18. Oh, all right. So moving on from the space of experiments, which I am only mildly qualified to teach in, so that's why I only spent about 10 minutes on that. Quasi-experiments are fundamentally different. So even though they use that same epistemology, that same idea of how we know something, they are very different than experiments. And there are lots of conditions that have to be considered when we're designing. So they share the same purpose as experiments. They're there to help us try to infer causality. And they share that same underlying logic, is that there is a counterfactual situation that wouldn't have occurred without the intervention. And they do need to meet all the basic conditions for causal inference that we talked about earlier. But, and they're subject to similar limitations in terms of context and assumptions. And they often have the same structural details, so the presence of a treatment and control group. But quasi-experiments have what we call more, they have a lot more threats to validity. So this idea, threats to validity of a causal inference. So the thing that's the most troublesome for us in quasi-experiments is that there are lots and lots of different reasons why we could be observing the effect we are that may or may not have to do with our treatment. So these threats to validity are something that we're constantly trying to decide whether are there or possibly there, whether they are a threat to the conclusion we're trying to draw. So these come up in a number of different ways. We do not have random assignment of treatment. So we're constrained on that. So that's one big threat to validity. We can't decide whether people go and live in high-density housing or low-density housing, whether people use a tram or a bus or drive their car, ride a bike. And we're not always able to create compelling approximations. So we may not have a control group. We may not be able to pre-test observations of an outcome. So for instance, in sudden onset events like disasters, we may not be able to establish a precondition that existed before so that we can measure change over time. So Shadish and his co-authors recommend three principles when you're working with quasi-experimental designs. So we want to spend a lot of time trying to identify and evaluate whether or not we have threats to internal validity, possible threats. And then try to control by design. So maybe multiple control groups, multiple baselines, statistical control, possibly, if that's and that's maybe a bit beyond the scope of this subject. And he also recommends coherent pattern matching. So this is where your explanation for your effect is complicated. And it accounts for all these conditions that may have been present in a way that has conditions and qualifications that make the argument more complex, but make it less likely that there is some other thing occurring that is causing your effect. So we try to, we start by trying to identify the things that could produce what we are observing that are not the thing we're interested in observing. So we start by trying to find the threats to validity, the other explanations, and identify them. Second thing we do is try to design the experiment to reduce or eliminate some of those explanations. And then the third thing we do is, if both of those things fail to eliminate some of our threats, we might need to weave a narrative that is more complicated about causality. So this is if we're going for full causality. So I'll get into what some of these things mean. There are a lot of quasi-experimental designs. And so we're going to talk about 5 major types. One group, pre-test and post-test design, post-test only design with a control group, non-equivalent comparison group design, equivalent comparison group design, and multiple intervention equivalent comparison group, pre-test, post-test with control. So those are pretty technical long terms, but this last one is one that if you can achieve this in a social science setting, you've reduced a lot of your threats to validity. So it's all been pretty abstract up to now. But let's turn back to one of the projects that we introduced toward the beginning of the semester, the Activity Centers project. So this is the implementation of Plan Melbourne and its predecessors through Melbourne back to 1981, where we had an implementation of a policy, a period of implementation, another policy in 1995, a period of implementation, another policy in 2002, a period of implementation, and a policy in 2014, and a period of implementation. Another change to the policy in 2016, and a period of implementation. So we've got all these implementation periods to observe the effect of the policy. But we do not have a control group. Because it's not like half of Melbourne got the policy and half didn't. It's for all, in a lot of cases, some of these are meant to apply to even more than metropolitan Melbourne. But the way that what the quasi-experimental design gets us is this these changing conditions over time. So these are national employment clusters, and I showed you these maps before where we showed that back in 1981 there was only the one national employment cluster, and then 4, and then 6, and then still in 6 in 2014. So the policy is changing. all the time. And so different places are affected by the policy at different time periods. So we've got these treatment periods. We've got these times at which something happens. 1981, there's a plan. 1996, there's a plan. 2002, there's a plan. 2014, there's a plan. So the question is, if there's a policy effect, places with activity centers and places without activity centers should diverge in their behavior. Now, the behavior in this case is jobs housing balance. So that's the way that we constructed it. It's an indicator that talks about, that computes how closely people live to where they work or how closely people work to where they live. But the point is that this is what we're looking for. We're looking for the moment of intervention producing a change in the treatment group and not the control group. So the group where something happened and not the counterfactual. But in our study, we didn't have any place in Melbourne. We couldn't just say, well, Melbourne, because we don't have a comparison. We don't have a counterfactual of not Melbourne. We don't have Melbourne without the policy. It's never occurred. So we do this thing that Shadish urges us to do, which is to control by design. So I'm going to talk a bit about that. So here's what we did. To control by design, we said, well, okay, it's true that we don't have a Melbourne without activity center policies. But Melbourne is carved up into little census areas. And those little census areas have different impact from the activity center policies based on how close they are to the activity centers. So there are activity centers that are designated. This is the 2002 plan designation. And each of these little circles represents an activity center. These big green ones are the national strategic activity centers, however those were decided then. But every one of these little places has an area of bigger impact, closer to the activity center, an area of smaller impact, further away from the activity center. So we are attempting to construct that control group by looking at the places that were in the influence area of an activity center and comparing those places to places that were not in the impact area. So for us, a treatment is not just Melbourne having a policy, but the place having more impact of the policy, the place being more affected by the policy. And we're asking this question of whether or not this actually mattered. So in our case, the treatment is having some area of your LGA covered by the policy. And our control is having some area of your LGA not covered by the policy. So anything outside the activity center is our place that's the counterfactual, the place that wasn't as affected by the policy as the places that got activity center designations. So there are a number of ways we can study this problem. So this notation gets a little technical, but it gets us away from those long sentences like those 1 to 5 things that I put up earlier. So in this case, O in 2011 and O in 2016, those refer to observation. We have a census in 2011, and we have a census in 2016. So at those 2 points, we can observe the condition of jobs housing balance. The census gives us that data. We know how many people worked where they lived and lived near where they worked in 2011. We know that same number in 2016. Fortunately for us, the policy occurred between. So the X refers to an intervention. So we can observe data before and after the intervention. So this is what we call a one-group pre-test and post-test design. We have one group, the suburbs of Melbourne. We have one intervention, the one policy, this is Plan Melbourne. and we have two observations, one before and one after. So that's where we get pre-test, post-test, one before, one after. And one group, that gets us the whole title. So in this case, if we look at Plan Melbourne, that's our intervention. And those are our two censuses. Now the one group pre-test and post-test design gets us what we call a weak inference on a causal relationship. So we've got one group, we've got no control group. We have an effect at the pre-test, an effect at the post-test. But because there's one group, we have no comparison. We have no way of knowing whether another group that didn't get the treatment would have something similar happen or not. So we call it a weak causal inference. Possible threats to validity in this case are that the entire region is gaining or losing jobs housing balance. So if we observe a change in jobs housing balance, it might be because it's happening everywhere. We can't see that in our current research design. It could be that something other than the policy is causing the changes. So let's say fuel prices have changed or home prices have changed. It might be that that's causing our change, not the policy. So we might decide instead to do another quasi-experimental design. So our number 2, post-test only design with a control group. So we might say, okay, well, we didn't really get to observe before 2014, but we have census data from 2016, and that's just very easy to get and put into the same spatial units. So what would happen if we do this? So above the line, we have our intervention, Plan Melbourne. And after that, at some point, we have an observation, the census, in 2016. And let's imagine that we found that the treatment group, the group above the line that got the treatment, had a measurement of 60% jobs housing balance. And the post-test on the control group yielded 40%. So these two groups give us different observations, 60 in one, 40 in another. We might be tempted to say, ooh, well, the intervention obviously produced something because post-test observations show that it's 60% for the treatment group and 40% for the control group. But it's possible that the groups were different before 2016. It's possible that when the policy was implemented, the groups were already different. So we don't have a clear inference here that the policy has changed our jobs housing balance. All we know is that the groups are different. They might have already been different. Number 3, a non-equivalent comparison group design. So in this case, we have an observation at 2011, a treatment, and an observation at 2016. But the difference is that the post-test is different than the pre-test group. So for census data, it does depend on what you choose. But if you don't have the same observations before and after, then it's possible that you'd have an effect that, so this is public transport mode share in Inner Melbourne before and after implementation of a free tram zone. So it's a hypothetical example. A control group, places in Inner Melbourne, that did not get a free tram. A treatment group, places in Inner Melbourne that did get a free tram. And we could see they're kind of tracking together, but the rate of growth is slightly higher in the comparison group. But a problem here is that if our post-test group is different than our pre-test group, then we might not be observing the same conditions before and after. So sometimes we don't have the luxury of having the two groups be the same. But if we want to compare apples to apples, as they say, we want to compare in the census, for instance, the same spatial units over time. So this is why I was such a stickler about making sure your map's aligned when you're looking at the census data. Make sure that if you're looking at a place, make sure it lines up together so that you are a little more clear that you've got that you're looking at the same thing over time. All right, a non-equivalent comparison group design. So now you have a pretest and a post-test, and you have an intervention, and you've constructed a control group without an intervention. That should be 2011. Where your pretest and your post-test groups are different observations. So this is starting to get more powerful. We have two groups, one treatment, one control, one gets the intervention, one doesn't. We have two observation periods, 2011 and 2016. And the only problem we have is that our pretest and post-test groups are not identical. So we don't know if it's the change of individuals that's created the different effect, or, because it actually could be a sampling problem. And we're going to talk about sampling next week, I'm reasonably sure. But it is still possible that sampling can yield different effects, that even random sampling can yield different units that produce different outcomes. So when you can, even though this is relatively more powerful, when you can, you really should stick to the same group in the before and after period. And when you can't, then you have a non-equivalent comparison group design. So it's important to highlight that. If you're not looking at the same data in one year and the next. So if you're going to do a survey for your study, let's say you're not looking at the census spatial units. And it's one thing if you're going to track those same people over 2 time periods, and it's a different thing if you're going to get one group and then go off and not look them up again and then survey another group. So if you're going to do the second way, now sometimes we just don't have the luxury. Like, what if you all went and graduated? I might not be able to survey you in analytical methods next year, right? I might need to go and find the next group of students in analytical methods. That's a different group. It gets me different outcomes. So the problem for us, the threats to us, is that our pretest and post-test groups are not comparable. And we don't necessarily know whether it's the different construction of the group that caused the effect compared with the actual intervention, the policy. So we're always wondering about this. So if we have an equivalent comparison group design, then we have, there's again my typo. We have a treatment and a control, an intervention and a control group, and the same group observed before and after. So this is much more powerful. We've eliminated the possibility that it's the sample that produced the effect. We've eliminated the possibility that the effect was already there before we designed the intervention. So this is what Shadish and authors mean by designing the quasi-experiment to try to control some of your threats to validity. If your threat to validity is the groups were already different, you can design that out by observing before and after. Sometimes we don't have the luxury of doing an actual observation before. Maybe we don't know the policy is coming. It happens in the middle of the night. That's not unusual here in Victoria. Okay, well, we can still look retroactively. With the census data, we can do that. That's one great thing about the census data. We can also ask people to recall what they felt like or what happened to them or how much money they earned 6 months ago or a year ago. So we can do retroactive designs. Same idea. Now, there are problems, there are threats to validity with asking people to recall things, because we all know people are terrible at recalling things. The research on, say, eyewitness testimony is a very good example of how awful we humans are at knowing what we actually saw. But this design controls for a lot of that problem. So we have the same group, and a remaining threat to validity, there are others, but a big one in this kind of design, even when we have the same group, is that the change was temporary. So we could have an activity center policy introduced, and the change, people behaved like, it was a more jobs, housing, balance, rich region for a year or two. And then once the census came and went, they went back to do the same old thing they always did. So this happens a lot in like dietary interventions and other things. There's a certain period at which the intervention works. And then after that, people kind of get used to it or they stop doing it, and the effect tapers off. So maybe people have gone into a training about behaving more like they're in a jobs, housing, rich city. There may be some point at which the effect tapers off. So that's one of our threats to validity that's still left. Even when we have a treatment group and a control group, we have a pre-test and a post-test, and we have the same group being observed across the time periods. So what do we do about that? Well, what we did in our study was we took a longer time horizon. So did I get my timeline right here? Yes, we did. So we looked at a multiple intervention, equivalent comparison, pre-test, post-test with control study. So what we did was we said, all right, there are 3 interventions in this timeline. There was Living Suburbs in 1995, Melbourne 2030 in 2002, and Plan Melbourne in 2014. Multiple interventions. We have multiple census observations. So in 1991, 96, 2001, 6, 11, and 16, we had censuses. So we can observe changes over multiple interventions and multiple time periods. And so that allows us to test the idea. So for instance, these 2 time periods here, this allows us to test the idea that the effect was temporary. 2002 to 2006 is 4 years. If we observe it here, we've observed a 4-year implementation period. If we observe it again in 2011, we've observed a 9-year implementation period. If that effect persists after 9 years, it's a stronger effect than if it stops after 4 years. We've run into the end of our data here, so we can't. Next census will come out. So we've got a treatment and control group. We've got places that had less activity center intervention or no activity center intervention, and those comprise our control group. But we still have threats to validity. So one of our threats to validity is that something other than our policy is causing the changes. So it could be that something across this entire time period has been driving the city to become more or less jobs, housing rich, and that we just simply don't know what it is and can't observe it. But you could see it starts to get more and more convincing as you add more implementation periods, more interventions, more observations. Our threats to validity become lower and lower and lower. So what you're trying to do when you're designing your experiment is to identify, number one, just identify what you've got. If you have different groups, let us know and identify some threats to validity that occur with that kind of design. If you have no treatment group, you have to have a treatment group. If you have no control group, Why not? Can you construct one? Remember, this is just a hypothetical exercise right now. So you've got the capacity to do that. If you're only observing at one time period, is it possible to design a retroactive question that would ask people to recall some of the things that happened in a previous time period so that you can get yourself into a design that's got a little more control for the threats to validity? And remember, what you're ultimately looking to see is whether there's a difference. So if the policies have had no effect, your treatment and control groups might be behaving relatively similarly. And that's what, this is a theoretical, like more of a schematic. But here, the places that have activity center interventions and the places without them are tracking more or less the same. One might be slightly higher, but they're not really changing relative to each other. Now, this is just one place and the jobs housing balance in that place. So maybe that place didn't have a change in the 1981 or the 1996 plan, but the 2001 plan produced a change. So this is the kind of effect that you're looking for. But it's also possible that the whole region was declining, and the activity center. So if our activity centers had stayed stable, but our non-activity centers had gone down, so something like, if activity center places look like that, I'll use them in the same color, and our non-activity centers had actually declined in jobs housing balance, this is still a positive effect of the policy because everywhere else got worse. And the places with activity centers didn't change all that much. This would be kind of like people dying from cancer and getting a drug intervention, finding that people died less, but compared to the control group. So, that would be. I'm not even going to. I think you get what I'm trying to say. I'm just going to turn myself around if I keep going with that one. Like I said, not qualified to teach about experimental conditions. So when you're thinking about your community profile, you're thinking about your methodology statement, think about where you are. If you're in a quantitative setting, if you're doing a confirmatory analysis, you have a treatment and control. You have a quasi-experimental design, whether you have acknowledged it or not. We love these little diagrams. They are so easy to do. They make it so easy to understand what you're trying to achieve. And when you map it from words to a visual, you start to understand. So these are really great to have. Putting one of these into your methodology statement will improve it a lot for you, based both on the reflection that you do about it and the our comprehension of what you're trying to achieve. So highly recommend having one of those. If you are doing a qualitative study, you don't necessarily need one, although they're not unheard of in qualitative studies. They're much more rare, but they're not, and certainly not required. So any questions about qualitative or quasi-experimental designs? This week, so next week we'll continue with sampling. Let me just have a look and see whether I think it probably makes sense to stop there and just hang around for a few more minutes and answer questions if anybody has any individual questions on the peer review exercise. And I'll give you the extra 5 minutes to kind of get where you're going. So we'll pick up on sampling next week. As long as you explain them all. Well, there might be only one method, but multiple documents too. Yeah, you can. I mean, it just depends on the conditions, but yeah. Yeah, sometimes it's just a matter of retrofitting your research questions to fit your methods that you want to try to do. Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, more words is no problem. Yeah, I mean, we're not going to be marking it, so.
Test the houses and discussing about experiments. But my question is I want to measure exact value of exact value. It's about elasticity of the land price with respect to the city population growth. So yeah, it's different from the quantitative method we mentioned. Main paper I follow, it just use OLS. It is a simple, very simple empirical analysis method. It may neglect, it may ignore the endogenous or sorry, I don't know whether you know these.
You haven't asked me a question, so.
Yeah, endogenous means when we estimate the coefficient of a variable, it's.
I understand statistics, yeah.
It's-
Okay. It's okay.
So I think I don't know how to deal with it. We could use a better method like IV instruct. Oh, sorry, I don't know how to.
Do you have you done some statistics?
Yeah.
So a statistical test like OLS or two-stage least squares or any other instrumental variables, they're all just hypothesis tests.
Yeah.
They are just
Yeah.
a set of hypothesis tests.
Yeah. It is a method to do hypothesis test, but I think if I want to exactly measure the impact of something on something, I want to extract its coefficient. I think it's a sorry. Could you give me a pen? Like.
I don't really have time to go through a regression equation with you, but it's a hypothesis test.
Yeah, not sure, but one want to use this exact value. It is not maybe not a hypothesis test.
It is.
I want to observe how.
Yep. You're
much
trying to
they-
observe whether that coefficient is 0 or non-zero. That's what the hypothesis test is.
Not zero. Not
It is.
zero.
It is. This is
Yeah.
it. So in linear regression, or any kind of regression, you will let's say you get a coefficient of 2.302.
Yeah.
This can be equal to 0 or not equal to 0
Yeah.
based on a significance value. So p-value
Yeah.
of say, if your p-value is 0.2, then it's equal to this is no effect.
Yeah,
and
it's
your,
zero.
It's zero. If your p-value is 0.02, then you have an effect, and your effect is
Yeah.
non-zero, and it's this. So you are testing a hypothesis. You're testing the hypothesis that this
Yes.
estimated coefficient is 0 or non-zero. So if you want to know the size of the effect, this is the best guess. But I don't think I've answered your question.
My topic is about the urban cost. It is opposite to the agglomeration economy, but it has a computation formulation is I must use this beta coefficient and with some other. So I need this
Yep.
exact value.
Yep.
It may, yes, I showed you. I must use this hypothesis test to determine if whether this coefficient is significantly, if it is significant. So if I use this. But my question is about the coefficient maybe not very exact because there are some variables are missing. We cannot control all the variables. So because OS is a very simple estimate strategy, I don't know how to deal with it. Even though I use IV regulation to deal with endogenous problems, but there is some other because I can't control all the economic, political factors.
Yeah.
I don't have a.
Those are your threats to validity, aren't they? Right?
Uh,
So you just want to mention it, that you may have because it's a theoretical exercise. So ordinarily squares, you're not stuck with that. You can do an instrumental variables regression. Because you're not doing it. You don't have to do it. You just have to say you're going to do it.
okay.
There's a threat to validity from endogeneity. To control for that, I'm going to use an instrumental variable, a two-stage least squares, or a generalized method of moments estimator to improve on the OLS estimation process. And basically what that gets you is, if you're collapsing, if you have, your y sub I equals alpha plus beta 1, and x1 plus beta 2, x2 plus your epsilon, your plus a, so this is your random error, and this is your non-random error.
Yeah.
That's correlated with the outcome, which two-stage least squares or another instrumental variables regression will help you control for. So yeah, you're absolutely right that you need another method, but you don't have to do it. You're not going to do this. You're just going to write the equation and you're going to say, one of the problems is endogeneity.
Yeah.
OLS keeps, forces, doesn't allow us to adjust for endogeneity, but instrumental variables procedures do. So you can just say that, and that's a good indication that you understand the extent of your problem, and at some point later in the future, if you're really interested in that problem, you're going to have to go and get skilled up on how to run instrumental variables regressions.